The second screencast in my journey through King Lear for the new Year 13 students who are about to study it looks in close detail at the first scene of the play. I should probably say at this stage that I don't intend to make a recording of every scene in the play. The first and second scene probably, and then maybe one or two other key scenes during the play. My intention is, however, to take students through this first scene in some detail, if only because it is such a magnificent example of how Shakespeare can open a play and within the scene manage not only to introduce the main plot of the play, but also the subplot, most of the key characters, though by no means all, and set the whole play running to such a degree that the audience cannot wait to move on into the meat of the play. It's worth remembering, incidentally, when I refer to audience, that all these plays of Shakespeare's were written to be performed. They were designed to be heard, designed to be seen. They weren't designed to be read. So don't worry if you find the wealth of language off-putting at first. A large proportion of any audience watching this play in the early 17th century would probably have been illiterate to all intents and purposes. Let the language work. Yes, we will have to analyse in depth, and yes, in this presentation I have referred to specific language, but remember, the language works in an auditory way. Let it do that. So, dividing the play up, or the scene up rather, I start off with lines 1 to 32. Shakespeare, as so often, begins his play in medias res, that is to say, we interrupt a discussion that is already in process, and it is the discussion between Kent and Gloucester of the division of the kingdom, which will drive the scene. However, after a couple of lines, this shifts, and the two of them discuss family issues. It's a humorous beginning to the play. They're actually discussing Edmund, the bastard son, who is going to become central to the subplot of the play, but at this stage is discussed purely in terms of his illegitimacy. He will get his spot in Act 1, Scene 2 to put his perspective on this, but at the moment he seems to be the model of good behaviour. I mean, quite apart from anything else, he is allowed at court. He's not perceived at this stage of anything untrustworthy. However, it's worth remembering that to a Jacobean audience, the very appearance of a bastard in the play would suggest that there was a lack of trust in this character. So Gloucester, discussing his son, or rather his illegitimate son, is humorous. There's no two ways about it. He takes Kent's presumably innocent "I cannot conceive you," Kent misunderstanding him or failing to understand him, as an opportunity to discourse on a variety of sexual puns. Sir, this fellow's mother could. Do you smell a fault in his birth? There's a pun here on the word fault, a crack, perhaps referring to female genitalia, as well as the sin of bastardy, and refers to the fact that there was good sport at his making. He was fun. However, the whoreson must be acknowledged. That's a very harsh word for your own offspring. The whoreson must be acknowledged. Straight away, we are given an indication of a theme that is going to dominate much of the play. However, rather than dwelling on it, Shakespeare interrupts the scene, lifts the entire tone of the scene by shifting to verse. After all, the king is about to come onto the stage. Everything should be heightened and removed from these rather low status discussions of sexual misbehaviour. And Lear appears on stage to reveal what he will call his darker purpose. Darker, hidden in this sense, and at this time it probably doesn't necessarily have any of the sinister overtones that it will certainly get later in performance history. He wishes to split the kingdom, yet wishes in some way to retain power. After all, when he moves from house to house, he's going to have his train of knights, and there's no indication as the play goes on that he has any indication of not being treated as though he were still king. I've talked about the difficulties, if you like, in splitting the kingdom in terms of the divine right of kings in an earlier screencast. The scene centres in these lines, lines 33 to 121, on the contest to show the greatest love, and two of the daughters, Goneril and Regan, seem prepared for a very formal scene. It is, after all, at court. That would itself create an interesting tension between the king, their father, who has to be distanced from them by nature of his royal position. The third daughter, Cordelia, won't resort to these rhetorical flourishes, such as might be expected at court, and in fact adopts a tone of plainness and honesty in her response before being rejected by Lear. She is rejected, disinherited, and publicly humiliated in these lines. Lines that we should be thinking about as we read here. I've started off with Lear saying, "Meantime we shall express our darker purpose." And I want to draw your attention to the use of the royal we, the use of the first person plural by the monarch when talking about themselves. The royal prerogative, as it's known, is repeated throughout Lear's first speeches. The we, the our, the our. Not only that, he's dealing with imperatives. "Give me the map," he cries. This does not seem to me to be a man who has lost his grip on power. There's always a tension with Lear of exactly how old and doddery the character is. This seems to me to be a man who is written with a degree of power still within him. The royal prerogative is continued into the question which sets the entire main plot in motion. "Which of you shall say doth love us most, that we our largest bounty shall extend?" And this seems to be Lear's, well, one of Lear's great faults. So obsessed is he with hearing that his daughters love him, that he is going to divide his kingdom in no rational way at all, but actually in terms of who pleases him best in this beauty contest. Goneril and Regan reply, Goneril going first. And there is humour, I think, here. The rather overdone manner of the response, leading to Regan's comment that she can match all of that, only she comes too short, she says, of her sister. And I think we should see a degree of humour here. Before Lear introduces Cordelia, "Now our joy, although our last and least." His youngest daughter, again the royal prerogative. She is being offered to either the King of France or the Duke of Burgundy, and the metaphors used refer to the vines of France or the milk of Burgundy, and I think this is important, and we'll come back to it a little later. Vines produce wine, which improves with age. Milk goes sour quickly. It's weak, much weaker than wine. However, Cordelia, with all honesty, tells Lear that she has nothing to say. And because of this, we get one of the most famous quotations of the whole play: "Nothing will come of nothing." As Lear launches into his attack to persuade her, he feels, to give him what he wishes, praise and verbal love. He is hurt, there's no doubt about it. So young, he says, and so untender. That intensity of the prefix heightening the negative, the lack of tenderness that he perceives. Cordelia, rather than answering the question or seeking to pour oil on troubled waters, replies, "So young, my lord, and true." And in doing so, accuses her sisters of their potential infidelity. Lear is offended beyond all measure, and in a speech calling upon ancient gods, this is not a play that deals with a Christian world, he disclaims all my paternal care, referring to her as my sometime daughter, as he banishes her into, well, he cares not where. In the next group of lines, Cordelia's case is taken up by the Duke of Kent. Now, it's worth thinking. We mentioned earlier Albany. We mentioned in an earlier podcast the idea of Albany and Cornwall being opposite ends of the kingdom. Now we have the Duke of Kent. Kent, not only often seen as the Garden of England, the area that perhaps most flourishes and most supports England, it's also, of course, the coastal region, which is going to be the buffer against foreign invasion from the rest of Europe, a vital duke in terms of safety of the realm. And Kent intercedes on Cordelia's behalf. He is at pains to show enormous honour to the king in all he says, and is able, in this passage, to allow Shakespeare to foreshadow the events of the play that will unfold. He too is now banished under sentence of death. His honouring of the king is clear. "Good my liege, royal Lear," constantly repeating this sense of deference to the king. But also challenging the king. When called upon to justify his behaviour, he can reply, "Be Kent unmannerly when Lear is mad?" Linking that again to plainness honour's bound when majesty falls to folly. Now, whether at this stage he is telling us that Lear is mad, or that Lear is just temporarily too angry to make sensible decisions, is really in the hands of a director and his or her actors. But it's the first mention, of course, of the theme that will dominate Lear, and will dominate the character of Lear's thinking about himself, as he begins to fear, and then ultimately does fall into, madness as the play unwinds. Another image that Kent brings up when banished from Lear's sight is to reply, "See better, Lear." And again, this image of the blind man seeing that will dominate the second half of the play gets its first mention. That the kingdom is already turned upside down by Lear's action is suggested in the final two quotations I've given here. "Kill thy physician, and thy fee bestow upon the foul disease, and freedom lives hence, and banishment is here." Two phrases referring to the world being turned upside down. And it is turned upside down by Lear's act of dividing the kingdom. The scene moves on inexorably. Cordelia, prior to being thrown out of the kingdom, is offered to either Burgundy or France. Effectively, she's put up to sale. Her dowry is removed, and she is offered to one of these personages. She's rejected by Burgundy, who simply states that if Lear chooses to reinstate the dowry, he'll have her, but if not, he won't. And accepted by France, who in doing so re-establishes, or establishes, probably for the first time in the play, the purity of love. Before she leaves, she makes it clear that she recognises her sisters for what they are. France re-establishes how close Cordelia was in the first of these quotations, the balm of your age, the soothing factor in Lear. And it is no accident, I suspect, that as soon as Cordelia has been removed from Lear, his distemper grows, his anger grows, his lack of control grows. She justifies to France the reasons that she is in trouble, saying that she lacks that glib and oily art to speak and purpose not. Again, another couplet in which she makes it quite clear that she sees through her sister's pretence, whilst justifying her own honour. France, in a line or a couplet that recalls Sonnet 116, those of you that read this as part of your edXL IGCSE course will remember that great sonnet, which looks at the nature and the unchangeability of love. Love's not love, we're told, when it is mingled with regards that stands aloof from the entire point. Love is not beholden to discussion, any discussion that moves it away from love is what is being said. Lear is allowed to re-establish his power when requested by Burgundy, whether he will give anything with Cordelia. Nothing, he replies. I have sworn, I am firm. Single line. I have sworn, I am firm. I mentioned on the first slide the use of the royal prerogative. It's interesting at this point that Lear seems to have lost it and seems to be referring to himself as a man now rather than as a king. And that we'll pick up in a later slide. As Cordelia leaves, she refers to her sisters. Love well our father, she says. To your professed bosoms I commit him. As though she is handing over Lear. We have to believe, particularly given all the praise that we've seen of her already in the scene, that she has really been the only daughter that is close to Lear. And she hands him over to their professed bosoms. She can see their lies. Time shall unfold what plighted cunning hides. Those oaths one swears as part of trickery. And still the scene is not finished. Shakespeare brings it to a conclusion by leaving the sisters on stage and letting them consider the events of the scene. They recognise that Lear is potentially dangerous to them due to the lack of self-control that he has shown. Well, he's just had the balm of his age removed. He's bound to have a certain amount of loss. They recognise the threat to them if Lear retains power. And they decide to act in order to prevent him from harming them. The quotations for this section that I want you to think about are these. First of all, noticing that the scene shifts back to prose once Lear has left the stage, and prose is right for this. It's a furtive discussion, the first of many, between these two sisters. The tone lowers, the tone becomes secretive. Next month, says Regan, he will stay with us. This may well be, and you need to think about this, an example of Regan adopting the royal prerogative. After all, she's been granted now half of the kingdom. We noted earlier that Lear had perhaps removed it at the height of his anger. And we noticed how strong was the use of this royal prerogative in his opening speech. He now seems to have lost it, and it seems to have transferred itself to Regan, though not to Goneril, interestingly. Goneril suggests that there's nothing particularly new to Lear losing his temper. You see how full of changes his age is. Regan picking up the idea, yet he hath ever but slenderly known himself, is able to suggest to us the theme that will run through the whole play of Lear gaining knowledge through his suffering and being able to eventually untangle himself once this knowledge is established. Goneril's concerns are made clear. If our father carry authority with such disposition as he bears, this last surrender of his will but offend us. This idea that should he continue to wield authority in any way, remember he's got 100 knights in his train, given his current frame of mind, his disposition, there is going to be a great problem in the future for Goneril and Regan. After all, they have just witnessed him banishing Kent, his hugely trusted lord, and rejecting Cordelia, who they know perfectly well is the daughter that he loves more than them. And in order that they might nip any problem in the bud, Goneril is allowed to close the scene with the line, "We must do something, and it's the heat." And thus the scene ends with the audience keenly anticipating what it might be that Goneril and Regan plan in order to reduce Lear's power. That, of course, will come to pass, and it seems that within the play itself, any idea that Goneril and Regan leave the stage in Act 1, Scene 1, to discuss and enact doesn't happen. They seem to respond to circumstances that unfold. Nevertheless, the cliffhanger on which the scene ends keeps the audience ready to see how Goneril and Regan are going to protect themselves from Lear as the play unravels. What the audience probably don't expect, of course, is what happens next, where, having met Edmund at the very beginning of the scene, seemingly a virtuous yet illegitimate son, the reality of the subplot is opened out in all its glory in Act 1, Scene 2.